A man spent 30 years building something with his hands and his name. Then he went away for a while, and when he came back, the men who used to work for him wouldn't look him in the eye. That's what almost happened to Bumpy Johnson in 1960. Not a bullet, not a bomb, not a war in the streets. The Mafia had learned its lesson about trying to kill Bumpy Johnson outright. They tried something quieter this time. They tried to ease him out, tell him he'd done enough, tell him it was time to rest, to enjoy what he'd built, to step back and let younger, more manageable men run things. A gold watch and a handshake, more or less. The kind of retirement you give someone when you don't want them around anymore, but you're too scared to say so directly. It almost worked, and then it didn't. And the way it fell apart says more about how power actually moves in the underworld than any shootout ever could. Most people who know the name Bumpy Johnson know the story that gets told the most, the one about the war with the Italians back in the 40s, the shootout at the card game, the truce that made him a legend in Harlem. Fewer people know what happened afterward, in the years when the war was already old news, when Johnson had already proven what he needed to prove, and the world assumed the fight in him was mostly finished. That's usually how it goes with men like him. The dramatic story gets remembered. The quiet one. The one that actually decided whether everything he'd built would survive into his old age, gets forgotten, mostly because nobody died in it, and nobody's blood ended up on a restaurant floor. But if you want to understand how a man actually holds on to power for decades, rather than just how he wins one dramatic fight and coasts on the reputation afterward, this is the story that matters more. To understand what happened in 1960, you have to go back further, because Bumpy Johnson wasn't some new face the mob was sizing up for the first time. By 1960, he was already a fixture, already a name that meant something on both sides of 110th Street. He'd come up through Harlem in the 20s and 30s, working for Stephanie St. Clair, the numbers queen who ran her own operation and fought off Dutch Schultz when Schultz tried to muscle in on her territory. Johnson was her enforcer, her collector, the man who made sure people paid what they owed and stayed where they were told to stay. When Schultz was killed and Lucky Luciano's people moved to take over the rackets that Schultz left behind, Johnson didn't fold. He negotiated. He got a deal that let him keep running Harlem's numbers game as long as a piece of it flowed downtown. It wasn't a perfect arrangement, but it was his, and more importantly, it was proof to everyone watching that a black man in Harlem didn't have to disappear just because the Italians wanted his territory. That reputation mattered more than any single dollar he made. People in Harlem didn't see Johnson as just another hustler skimming off the poor. They saw him as someone who'd stood in a room with the most dangerous men in New York and walked out with his name intact. He gave money to families who needed rent. He paid for funerals. He knew half the preachers in Harlem by their first names and the other half by favors owed. His wife, Mamie, used to say people would come to their door at all hours, not to buy anything, just because they knew Bumpy would help if he could. He wrote poetry, actual poetry, published some of it in local magazines, and carried himself less like a gangster and more like a man who happened to be in a dangerous business. Frank Lucas, who came up watching him years later, said Johnson didn't move like the men around him. He moved like someone with somewhere better to be. His marriage to Mamie Hatcher only added to that image. They met at a party in the late 40s, and within months, he'd decided she was the one he wanted, which surprised people who knew him as a man who kept his personal life quiet, and his romantic life quieter still. Mamie wasn't from the underworld, and she never fully joined it even after they married. She kept her own opinions about the life he led, kept her own friendships outside of it, and years later she'd write about their marriage with more honesty than most gangster wives allow themselves, describing a man who could be tender at home and untouchable on the street, sometimes within the same hour. That contrast, the poet and the enforcer living in one body, was part of what made Johnson so hard for people to categorize, and it was part of what made Harlem trust him in a way they never trusted the men who came after him. He didn't perform respectability, he simply had it, alongside everything else he had. By the early 50s, though, the federal government had built a different picture of him, one with none of the poetry in it. Agents had been circling Harlem's narcotics trade for years, and Johnson's name kept surfacing in the middle of it, whether or not every allegation against him was fair. In 1952, they finally had enough to move, and a conspiracy charge tied to narcotics landed on him with a heavy sentence attached, the kind of number that's designed less to punish one specific crime and more to remove a man from circulation entirely. He fought it the way he fought everything, with lawyers instead of guns this time. But eventually the fight ran out of road, and the sentence stood. But respect doesn't stop federal prosecutors, and by the early 50s, Johnson was in serious legal trouble. He got hit with a conspiracy charge tied to narcotics, and the sentence that came down was long. He went away to some of the toughest federal facilities in the country, including a stretch-out at Alcatraz, the island prison built specifically to hold men the government didn't trust anywhere else. Alcatraz wasn't like the local jails he'd cycled through earlier in his career, short stays where he could still send word back to Harlem and keep half an eye on his business through visitors and letters that made it past the censors. Alcatraz was built to cut a man off completely. Mail was read line by line before it ever reached him. Visits were rare and heavily supervised. The guards there weren't interested in men running empires from behind bars, and they made sure of it in ways that had nothing to do with cruelty and everything to do with design. For most of the back half of the 50s, Bumpy Johnson wasn't running anything. He was locked in a cell 3,000 miles from Harlem, reading, writing what letters the prison allowed, and waiting on a release date that kept feeling further away than it actually was. He filled the time the way disciplined men in his position often did, by staying sharp instead of letting the years soften him. He read constantly, kept up with newspapers when he could get them, and by all accounts spent a good deal of that time thinking not about revenge or bitterness, but about what he'd do differently when he finally walked back out into the world. He'd already lived through one war with the Mafia and won it through patience and leverage rather than brute force. There's reason to believe those years on the island only sharpened his instinct that patience, not violence, was the tool that actually worked against people who had more guns and more money than he did. He came out of Alcatraz older, thinner, and by most descriptions, calmer than the man who'd gone in, which made him easy for people downtown to underestimate, and that underestimation would end up costing them more than they expected. There's a particular kind of transformation that happens to men who survive long stretches in a place built specifically to break them, and it doesn't always look the way people expect. Some come out angrier, harder, looking for the first opportunity to prove they weren't broken after all. Others come out quieter, having spent so many years with nothing to do but think, that they emerge with a clearer sense of what actually matters and what was never worth the energy to begin with. By every account, from people who knew him before and after, Johnson belonged to the second category. He didn't come home looking to settle scores or prove a point to anyone. He came home paying closer attention than he ever had before, watching everything, saying less than usual, and letting other people fill silences with information they didn't realize they were giving away. That habit, more than any single decision he made, is probably what saved him during the year that followed. And while he waited, Harlem kept moving without him. This is the part people forget when they tell the story of Bumpy Johnson. They like to jump straight from the war with the Italians in the 40s to the legend he became by the end of his life. Like his career was one long, unbroken climb. It wasn't. There was a gap. A real one. Years where the man everyone in Harlem thought of as untouchable was sitting in a cell, and the businesses he'd spent decades building had to survive without him standing over them. Harlem itself was changing too, and not slowly. The post-war years had brought more people north, more crowding, more desperation, and with desperation came a market the old numbers racket couldn't touch in the same way: heroin. It had existed in the city before, but through the 50s, it grew into something bigger, more organized, more profitable than policy slips and betting sheets ever were. The Italian families, down in Manhattan and Brooklyn, understood this shift faster than almost anyone. They didn't need to control every street corner in Harlem the way they'd once tried to control the numbers game. They just needed to control the supply. Whoever controlled the drugs coming into the neighborhood controlled the neighborhood, no matter whose name people still respected on the street. By the time the calendar turned toward 1960, The men running things for the Genovese family, men like Vincent Gigante, who everyone called Chin, had spent years quietly filling the space Johnson left behind. Gigante was a different kind of operator than the men who'd run the commission back in the 40s. Younger, quieter in public, more comfortable letting business speak for itself instead of holding court the way old-school bosses once had. He'd come up as muscle before working his way into more serious responsibility, and by the time Johnson's release date started circulating, Gigante and men like him were the ones actually deciding how Harlem's narcotics trade would be organized going forward, not the aging figures who'd once negotiated directly with Johnson and remembered exactly how expensive that war had been. Not by declaring war. Nobody wanted a repeat of 1943, when 4 men got killed in a card room, and the whole thing turned into a public embarrassment that dragged in federal investigators. This time, the approach was patient, almost bureaucratic. Local runners who used to answer only to Johnson's people found it easier and safer to also answer to new suppliers who controlled the product they needed to move. Money that used to flow up through Johnson's network started finding other channels. None of it looked like a takeover if you squinted at any single piece of it. All of it added up to one if you looked at the whole picture. The mechanics of it were simple once heroin entered the equation. And that simplicity is exactly what made it so effective. Running numbers required relationships, trust built over years, a network of runners and collectors and bettors who all knew each other and knew who to answer to. Moving heroin required something different. It required access to the product, and the product came from ports and processing labs and shipping routes that had nothing to do with who was popular on 125th Street. The Italian families, through their connections stretching from the docks of the city out to sources overseas, controlled that access almost completely. A Harlem dealer with the best relationships in the world still needed someone downtown to actually put drugs in his hands. And that single fact quietly rearranged the balance of power in the neighborhood in a way no amount of community loyalty could undo on its own. Men who'd once needed Johnson's blessing to operate now needed a supplier's blessing instead, and increasingly, those were not the same people. It's worth saying plainly that this shift wasn't something the mob invented out of nowhere to spite Johnson. It was already happening on its own, driven by demand, by desperation in neighborhoods hit hard by unemployment, and by a drug that offered an escape uglier and more permanent than any numbers bet ever could. The Italian families simply positioned themselves at the center of a wave that was rising anyway, the same way smart operators always do. But the effect on Johnson's future, whether or not it was designed with him specifically in mind at first, was the same either way. The ground he'd have to stand on when he came home was not the ground he'd left behind. And somewhere in the middle of that slow shift, word started reaching the men downtown that Johnson's sentence was coming to an end. He was going to get out. He was going to come home, to Harlem, expecting to pick up exactly where he'd left off. That created a problem, and it wasn't a small one. There was also a wider backdrop that made everyone downtown more careful than they might otherwise have been. A few years earlier, state police had stumbled onto a gathering of mob bosses from around the country at a house in a small town called Appalachian in upstate New York, and the fallout from that discovery had been enormous. Suddenly, there was a Senate committee digging into organized crime with real teeth, reporters writing about the Mafia as a national organization rather than a collection of local gangs, and a level of public attention that made every family in the country more cautious about anything that might draw a headline. Against that backdrop, a public war in Harlem, even a smaller one than 1943, was the last thing anyone downtown wanted their name attached to. It made the quiet approach to Johnson even more attractive, because quiet was exactly what the moment called for. If Johnson came home and found his old organization gutted, if he understood exactly how much ground had shifted while he was gone, there was no telling what he'd do about it. This was a man who'd already proven, once, that he'd rather go to war than accept being pushed aside. He'd already shown he had informants everywhere, that he understood leverage better than most professional strategists, that he could turn a losing position into a stalemate through sheer patience and nerve. Killing him was still off the table, for the same reasons it had always been off the table. Harlem loved him, The community would notice, and any hint that the mob had moved on Bumpy Johnson again would bring exactly the kind of attention nobody downtown wanted, especially with federal agencies already circling organized crime harder than they had in years. There was a second reason for caution that had nothing to do with the Mafia's own internal politics. The country was changing in ways nobody in either world could ignore. Students in the South were sitting down at lunch counters and refusing to move until they were served. Civil rights organizations were building the kind of national momentum that would define the decade ahead, and Harlem itself was full of churches, community groups, and local leaders who paid close attention to anything that looked like an attack on one of their own. A story about Italian gangsters using violence or intimidation to strip power away from Harlem's most respected underworld figure was exactly the kind of story that could hand ammunition to anyone looking to paint organized crime as one more system built to keep black communities down. Nobody downtown wanted their name in that particular headline. So a different idea started getting discussed in the same kind of rooms where the 1943 ultimatum had once been drafted. Instead of removing Johnson, why not just let him retire? Let him come home, to money, to comfort, to the appearance of respect. Give him a piece of the action just large enough that he wouldn't feel insulted, and quietly make sure the real decisions, the supply lines, the muscle, the actual control of Harlem's drug trade, moved through other hands. Tell him, in as many polite words as it took, that his war days were behind him, and that a man his age had earned the right to slow down. Make it sound like a gift instead of what it actually was, which was a soft eviction from his own kingdom. The conversation where this idea took shape wasn't a single dramatic sit-down the way the 1943 meeting at Ralph's had been, at least not by most accounts. It was closer to a running discussion that happened in pieces, over dinners and card games and quiet phone calls, among men who had every reason to be careful about what got said out loud and who too. But the shape of the argument, when people pieced it together later, went something like this. Somebody would point out that Johnson still had the community behind him, that hitting him would be exactly as costly now as it had been 17 years earlier, maybe more so, given how much attention federal investigators were already paying to the city's rackets. Somebody else would push back, saying that letting him walk back into full control of anything in Harlem was its own kind of risk, a reminder to every other operator in the city that the commission could be outlasted if you were stubborn enough. There were practical voices in the mix too, men less interested in symbolism and more interested in the ledger. They pointed out that Johnson's cut, even at its old size, had never been the largest piece of what Harlem generated anymore. Not since heroin had overtaken policy as the neighborhood's most profitable business. Paying him something, even a diminished something, cost far less than the alternative of provoking another public conflict that could freeze operations across the whole city while federal investigators circled. From a pure accounting standpoint, buying his quiet cooperation looked like the cheapest option on the table. Cheaper than war, cheaper than a prolonged standoff, cheaper than anything that might draw attention. It was, in its own cold way, a completely rational plan. It simply failed to account for the one variable that never showed up in anybody's accounting, which was exactly how much Johnson valued being underestimated by people who thought a ledger could explain him. And somewhere in between those two positions, the idea of a soft retirement took hold, because it seemed to solve both problems at once. Nobody had to kill a beloved figure. Nobody had to hand him back real power either. He'd get comfort, and comfort, the thinking went, has a way of making even proud men quiet. It's worth sitting with how clever this actually was, because it was cleverer than sending gunmen ever could have been. Violence gives a man something to fight against. Vague, polite condescension gives him nothing to grab onto. How do you fight back against people who keep telling you they respect you while quietly making sure you have nothing left to run? How do you rally a community against an insult nobody said out loud? The mob had learned that killing Johnson made him a martyr and a legend. They were betting that simply outlasting him, wearing him down with time and gentle dismissal, might finally do what bullets never could. When Johnson came home, he came home carrying himself the way he always had, calm, unhurried, dressed sharper than the situation called for, because that was who he was. May met him, and so did a handful of old friends who'd stayed close through the years he was gone, and for a day or two, the homecoming looked exactly like what everyone hoped it would be. A hero, returning to a neighborhood that never stopped claiming him. Harlem welcomed him back like the community always did, with respect that hadn't faded an inch during his years away. People stopped him on the street just to shake his hand. Old women who remembered him as a young man running errands for Stephanie St. Clair told him they'd prayed for his release. Bar owners sent drinks to his table, which he never ordered. Kids too young to know exactly what he'd done pointed him out to each other on the way. Kids point out anyone their parents whisper about with a mix of fear and admiration. For a stretch of days, it genuinely felt like nothing had changed, like the years away had simply been a pause button on a life that was picking back up exactly where it left off. But underneath the welcome, something had shifted, and it didn't take him long to feel it. It showed up first in small ways, the kind of thing a less careful man might have dismissed as nothing. A restaurant where he used to have a standing table found reasons the table wasn't available. A tailor who used to open early just for him now needed an appointment scheduled days in advance. None of it was disrespect exactly. It was more like a slow recalibration, the world quietly testing how much room he still actually took up. The men who used to report to him every week, the runners who used to bring him a straight accounting of every policy bank in Harlem, were slower to show up now. Some came by out of loyalty and told him what he already suspected, that things had changed, that new suppliers had inserted themselves into corners of the business that used to be entirely his. Others didn't come by at all, and their absence told its own story. One man in particular, a longtime lieutenant who used to handle collections on 3 separate blocks for him, sent word through a cousin that he was tied up with other obligations and would come by when things settled down. Things never settled down enough for him to come by at all. Johnson noticed, filed it away, and said nothing about it to anyone, which was its own kind of message, though not the kind the lieutenant would understand until much later. A few months into that first year home, the offer finally came in a form Johnson couldn't pretend not to notice. A well-dressed man he half recognized from before his sentence came by, with an invitation to a dinner, framed as a courtesy, a welcome home gesture from people who respected what he'd built. Johnson went, because refusing would have told them he already understood what was happening, and he wasn't ready to hand them that information yet. Over the meal, wrapped in enough compliments to fill an entire evening, came the actual proposal. He'd keep a comfortable cut from a few specific operations, enough to live well for the rest of his life. He'd be introduced, whenever it was useful, as a respected elder of Harlem's business community, a man whose blessings still meant something. And in exchange, he'd step back from the daily decisions, the supply arrangements, the disputes between operators, and let a newer generation, people who understood the realities of a business that had grown more complicated since his conviction, handle the parts of it that required constant attention. Nobody used the word retirement. They didn't need to. The shape of the offer said it plainly enough. Johnson listened the whole way through without interrupting, the same way he'd listened to Costello's messenger back in 1942, nodding at the right moments, thanking them for their consideration, and giving no answer at all beyond a vague comment about needing time to settle back into life outside. It wasn't agreement, but it wasn't the flat refusal he'd once given either, and that alone told the men at the table everything they wanted to hear. They left the dinner believing the matter was as good as settled. Johnson left it having learned exactly how far along their plan already was, and exactly how much they'd underestimated him by assuming silence meant surrender. Meetings that should have happened with him at the head of the table started happening without him, and when he asked about it, the answers he got were smooth and careful, full of respect and short on actual information. He'd hear, secondhand, that a decision had already been made about how a certain corner would be run, or which supplier a certain runner would deal with going forward, and when he brought it up directly, the men explaining it to him always framed it as something already settled, rather than something up for discussion, always wrapped in enough deference that objecting felt petty. Nobody told him no to his face. Nobody needed to. He was simply, gradually, not being included, the way a man gets quietly excluded from decisions at a company he used to run, not through any single act of disrespect, but through 100 small ones, none large enough on its own to be worth a fight. There's an old idea that the most dangerous kind of insult is the one wrapped in courtesy, because you can't respond to it without looking paranoid or ungrateful. That's exactly the position Johnson found himself in during those first months home. If he pushed too hard, demanded answers, made noise about being cut out, he risked looking like an old man clinging to a throne that had already moved on without him. The mob wasn't threatening him. They were smiling at him. They were sending him gifts, inviting him to dinners, calling him a legend, a founder, a man whose contribution to how things worked in New York would never be forgotten. And in the same breath, they were making sure his actual influence over Harlem's most profitable business kept shrinking. Johnson had lived long enough and survived enough to recognize what was happening for exactly what it was. He wasn't being honored. He was being managed. There's a particular kind of humiliation in being treated gently by people who used to fear you, because the gentleness itself is the message. It says, quietly, that you no longer matter enough to be dangerous. A man they still feared would have been kept at a careful distance, negotiated with cautiously, watched for signs of anger. A man they no longer feared could be invited to dinner, praised warmly, sent home with a bottle of good wine, and no real information about what had actually been decided, while he sat there smiling along with everyone else. That distinction between fear and affection was one Johnson understood better than almost anyone in his line of work, because he'd spent his entire career watching how quickly one could curdle into the other depending on which side held the leverage. In 1943, the families had feared him enough to negotiate seriously, and, eventually, to pay him tribute for the privilege of doing business in his territory. Now, less than 2 decades later, they'd decided that fear was no longer the correct instrument to use on him, and had replaced it with something that looked, on its surface, far kinder. He knew better than to mistake kindness offered from a position of strength for anything other than what it was. Most men in his position, at his age, with his health starting to show the wear of a hard life and years behind bars, might have accepted the comfortable exit, the money, the title without the power, the chance to spend his remaining years as a respected elder statesman instead of a man fighting uphill against people half his age with entire supply chains behind them. Nobody would have blamed him for it. He'd already fought one war for Harlem and won it. He'd already proven what needed proving. But Johnson understood something the men managing his retirement hadn't fully accounted for, which is that influence in Harlem was never only about money. It was about relationships built over decades, about favors extended to people who never forgot who helped them when nobody else would, about a network of loyalty that didn't show up on any ledger the mob could see or measure. He might have lost ground in the drug trade while he was locked away. He hadn't lost the thing that made him valuable to Harlem in the first place, which was trust. So instead of fighting the way he'd fought in 1943, with shows of force and public defiance, Johnson did something slower and, in its own way, more dangerous to the people trying to sideline him. He started listening. He spent those early months back home doing what looked, from the outside, like exactly what the mob wanted him to do. He kept a lower profile. He didn't make demands. He didn't call meetings, threatening consequences. He let people believe the story that he'd come home tired, older, content to collect what he was given and let the younger operators handle the grind of the streets. And while everyone assumed that story was true, he was quietly rebuilding the only kind of power that had ever actually belonged to him, which was information and loyalty, gathered one relationship at a time. He reconnected with runners who drifted away, not by demanding they come back, but by helping them with problems that had nothing to do with business. A man whose son had been arrested found that Johnson had already made a call before he even asked. A woman running a small policy bank who was getting squeezed by a new supplier found that the supplier suddenly backed off after a quiet word from someone she had never even known Johnson had spoken to. None of it looked like a campaign to reclaim his territory. All of it, stitched together, was exactly that. At the same time, he started paying attention to the next generation coming up in Harlem's underworld. Young men who'd grown up watching him from a distance, and who were hungry in a way the older generation, comfortable, and complacent, no longer was. One of them was a young man named Frank Lucas, who would go on decades later to build one of the largest heroin operations in the country's history, but who back then was just another sharp, ambitious face on the fringes of Harlem's rackets, doing small jobs, watching how the real operators carried themselves. Johnson took an interest in him the way he'd taken an interest in plenty of young men over the years, not out of sentiment, but because a smart older man in a shrinking position understands the value of loyal, capable people who haven't yet decided where their loyalty belongs. He'd take Lucas along to appointments, let him sit quietly in the corner of a diner while older men talked business, then afterward explain what had actually happened underneath the conversation. Who was lying, who was scared, who was worth trusting, and who wasn't. He taught him to dress the way he dressed, plainly but well, nothing flashy enough to draw attention from the wrong people. He taught him patience above everything else, telling him more than once that the men who lasted in that life were never the loudest ones in the room. Lucas would later say that everything he understood about how to move through that world with discipline instead of chaos, he learned by watching Johnson up close during those years. That kind of mentorship wasn't charity, it was an investment. Every young man Johnson pulled close and taught was another set of eyes and ears in a Harlem the mob thought they'd already quietly taken over, and every one of them would remember, later, exactly whose side they'd learned to stand on. He rebuilt his information network the same patient way he rebuilt everything else during those years, piece by piece, favor by favor. A cab driver who spent his nights ferrying men between Harlem and downtown started mentioning, in passing, who he'd driven and where they'd gone. A woman who cleaned offices near where certain meetings happened kept an ear open without ever being asked to, simply because she liked Johnson and disliked the men who'd started showing up more often in the neighborhood, acting as if they owned it. None of these people thought of themselves as informants. They thought of themselves as neighbors, doing an old friend a small courtesy, which was exactly the kind of loyalty money alone could never buy, and exactly the kind the men managing Johnson's retirement had no real way to compete with, because they'd never bothered building it themselves. They'd been too busy managing supply chains to notice that supply chains don't talk back, don't warn you when something's wrong, and don't care about you one bit once a better offer comes along. He also never stopped being the man Harlem's ordinary residents trusted more than they trusted the police, or the courts, or anyone downtown. That trust had a use beyond sentiment. It meant Johnson kept hearing things long before the mob's people did, because the community talked to him and stayed quiet around outsiders on principle. A supplier moving product through a new corner. A corrupt officer is taking money from two different sides and playing them against each other. A meeting is happening somewhere. It shouldn't have been discussed so loosely. All of it eventually found its way back to Johnson, the same way it always had, because Harlem hadn't stopped being Harlem just because he'd spent a few years away. The men managing his retirement, meanwhile, had a problem they didn't fully understand yet. They'd assumed that controlling supply lines and paying off a handful of key operators was the same thing as controlling Harlem. It wasn't, and the gap between those two things was exactly where Johnson was rebuilding himself. A drug supply chain moves product. It doesn't settle disputes between neighbors, doesn't smooth over tension when police pressure builds, doesn't command the kind of loyalty that makes a community close ranks and go quiet when outsiders start asking questions. Those things still belong to Johnson, because they always had, and no amount of quiet financial maneuvering from downtown could buy that kind of standing overnight. There was one moment during that period that came closer than anything else to breaking the quiet approach he'd chosen. A younger operator working under one of the new suppliers, impatient with how much ground Johnson was slowly reclaiming, and annoyed that his own standing kept getting undercut by an old man everyone thought was supposed to be finished, decided on his own to send a message. He had a few of his people rough up one of Johnson's runners on a street corner in broad daylight. Nothing fatal, but public and deliberate, the kind of thing meant to remind the neighborhood who was really in charge now. It was exactly the sort of provocation that could have pulled Johnson back into the kind of open conflict he'd spent months carefully avoiding. He didn't take the bait. Instead of sending anyone to answer the insult directly, Johnson made a call to people downtown who had far more to lose from an unauthorized flare-up than he did, and let them handle their own man. Whether out of genuine respect for the arrangement or simple self-interest in keeping things quiet, the families dealt with the operator themselves, and word came back to Johnson within the week that the man had been told, firmly, to leave Harlem's business to people who actually understood how to run it. Nobody ever told Johnson exactly what happened to the young operator afterward, and he never asked. That, too, was part of how he operated. He didn't need every detail. He only needed to know that the people downtown had chosen this once to protect the peace rather than test it, and that single choice told him more about where things actually stood between them than any dinner conversation ever could. Johnson never spoke publicly about the incident, never let it become a story the way the Rhythm Club shootout once had, but everyone who mattered understood what it proved. He wasn't just rebuilding quietly. He was doing it well enough that even the people he was supposedly retired from could be made to police their own ranks on his behalf. Slowly, cracks started to show in the arrangement that the mob thought they'd settled. Some of the operators they'd installed to handle the day-to-day business in Harlem started running into resistance they couldn't explain. Deals that fell through for reasons nobody could quite trace. Corners that used to be reliable suddenly turning cold. A supplier who'd been moving product through a particular block for over a year found, without warning, that the people on that block had simply stopped answering their door to him, choosing instead to deal with someone else entirely. Someone who happened to have Johnson's blessing, even if his name was never mentioned in the transaction. A new operator trying to expand into a stretch of Lenox Avenue that had always belonged, informally, to people loyal to Johnson, found himself constantly running into small, unexplainable friction. Missing shipments, unreliable lookouts, tips to police that always seemed to land at the worst possible moment. None of it traced back to any single order Johnson had given, because he'd learned decades earlier never to give the kind of order that could be traced. Police pressure, oddly, started landing harder on operations that had nothing to do with Johnson, and lighter on anything connected to people he'd quietly helped over the years. Precinct captains who'd taken money from Johnson long before his conviction, and who owed him favors going back further than that, found reasons to look the other way on certain blocks, while suddenly discovering probable cause on others. None of it could be proven as his doing, because that was the entire point of how he was doing it. There was no note pinned to anyone's jacket this time, no dead body left as a message, the way there had been outside a rhythm club 2 decades earlier. There was just a slow, steady tightening, the kind that's almost impossible to fight because there's no single enemy to point at, no single decision to reverse. Just 100 small currents all quietly running in the same direction. By the time a full year or so had passed since his release, the men downtown were forced to admit, in the same kind of quiet meetings where they'd decided to ease him out in the first place, that the plan wasn't working the way they'd expected. Johnson hadn't made noise. He hadn't threatened anyone. He hadn't given them a single excuse to treat him as a problem the way they had back in the 40s. He had simply, patiently, made himself necessary again, the same way he'd made himself necessary the first time around, except this time without a single shot fired. There's a particular kind of respect that grows out of watching someone outmaneuver you without ever raising their voice, and that's what started happening among the people who'd spent the better part of a year trying to gently retire him. It's one thing to lose a fight to a man who comes at you with guns and threats. There's a story you can tell yourself about that, a story about being outnumbered or unlucky. It's a different thing entirely to realize the man you tried to quietly push aside simply outthought you at your own game, using nothing but patience and relationships you couldn't see forming until they were already in place. Eventually, the arrangement got renegotiated, quietly, the same way everything in that world got settled, over dinner rather than in the street. Nobody announced it. There was no meeting at a funeral home this time, no mediator needed, because Johnson hadn't forced a crisis that required one. By most accounts, one of the men who'd originally floated the idea of easing him out sat with him privately, somewhere quiet, and admitted, in language careful enough to leave both of them room to save face, that the community still ran through him whether anyone downtown liked it or not, and that fighting that fact any longer was costing more than accepting it. Johnson, for his part, didn't gloat, didn't ask for an apology, didn't even bring up the months of small slights directly. He simply asked what a working arrangement going forward would look like. The same practical question he'd have asked about any piece of business, and let the conversation move from there. By most accounts, the man across the table finally said something close to this, that they'd figured a man his age, fresh out of a long stretch, would want to slow down, and that they'd been wrong to assume slowing down and disappearing were the same thing. Johnson reportedly told him that he'd never once asked to be handled gently, that he'd only ever asked to be dealt with honestly, and that honesty would have cost them nothing compared to what a year of guessing at his intentions had actually cost. Neither man raised his voice. Neither man needed to. They finished the meal, shook hands, and went back to running their respective corners of a business that, whether either side loved the arrangement or not, worked better with both of them at the table than with one of them quietly edged out of the room. He simply resumed a level of involvement in Harlem's business that matched the influence he'd rebuilt on his own terms. And the men downtown found it easier to work with him honestly than to keep pretending a retirement that clearly wasn't sticking. People outside Harlem noticed too, even if none of it made the papers the way the 1943 war eventually did. Other black operators running rackets in other cities, men who'd watched from a distance as the Italian families expanded their reach into every profitable corner of urban crime through the 50s, took note of how the situation in Harlem had resolved. The lesson they drew from it wasn't about violence. It was about patience, about the value of relationships that couldn't be bought out from under you, the way a supply contract could, about the fact that a man who'd built real standing in his own community still had leverage, even after the ground beneath him had visibly shifted. In a decade that would go on to produce louder, angrier assertions of black economic and political independence across the country, Johnson's quiet refusal to be managed out of relevance became one more small data point in a much larger argument that was just beginning to take shape. The supply lines they'd built while he was away didn't disappear, and Johnson never fully reclaimed the exact position he'd held before prison. The drug trade in Harlem had grown too big, too tied to organizations bigger than any one man, for that to be realistic. But the idea that he could simply be managed out of relevance, handled like an aging figurehead with no real leverage left, that idea died quietly sometime in the early 60s. And it died because Johnson refused to let it become true, even when everyone around him assumed it already was. What makes this version of the story different from the war in 1943 isn't the stakes. The stakes, in some ways, were higher because heroin was already reshaping Harlem in ways gambling never had, and the men controlling that trade had resources and reach that the old numbers rackets couldn't match. What's different is the method. In 1943, Johnson won by making violence too expensive for the mob to justify. In 1960, he won by making patience too expensive for them to sustain. They'd built an entire plan around the assumption that a man in his mid-50s, worn down by prison, would either accept a comfortable exit or lash out in a way they could contain and punish. He did neither. He simply waited, watched, rebuilt what actually mattered, and let their own plan collapse under the weight of everything it had failed to account for. Think about what the mob was actually betting on when they chose the quiet approach. They were betting that age and exhaustion would do the work violence couldn't. They were betting that a man freshly out of federal prison, with a wife waiting for him and a body that had spent years absorbing the wear of hard confinement, wouldn't have the appetite left for another long fight. It wasn't an unreasonable bet. Plenty of men in Johnson's position, at his age, with his history, would have taken the money and the title and called it a fair trade for everything they'd already survived. The mistake wasn't in making that bet. The mistake was in assuming that Johnson's fight had ever been about appetite for conflict in the first place. It hadn't. It had always been about refusing to let other people decide, on his behalf, what he was still capable of. That refusal didn't require youth or energy or a taste for danger. It only required him to keep showing up, keep listening, keep being the man people in Harlem turned to first, for as long as it took the other side to run out of patience of their own. At home, Mame watched most of this unfold from close enough to see the toll it took on him, even when he refused to show it to anyone else. She'd later describe those months as some of the quietest and most tense of their marriage, not because he was ever cruel or short with her, but because she could tell when something was eating at him even when he insisted everything was fine. He'd come home from a dinner with a strained smile, saying almost nothing about who'd been there or what was discussed, and she'd know from the set of his shoulders that the evening hadn't gone the way he wanted people to believe it had. She never pushed him to talk about business, understanding by then that it wasn't her place and wasn't something he'd share even if she asked. But she noticed things anyway, the way wives in that world always seem to notice things nobody told them directly. She noticed which old friends stopped calling. She noticed the new names he started mentioning, younger men she'd never heard of before, brought up in passing the way a man mentions people he's decided are worth paying attention to. Looking back on those years later, she said she understood, even without being told, that her husband was fighting something, just not with the kind of weapons anyone could see. Johnson never talked about that period the way he'd once talked about the war with the Italians 2 decades earlier. There was no dinner years later where old rivals sat across from each other and toasted the outcome, at least none that got written down or remembered the way the reconciliation with Frank Costello had been. This fight didn't have a clean ending because it was never a clean fight to begin with. It was a slow erosion on one side and a slow rebuilding on the other, and by the time it resolved, nobody could point to a single date and say that's when it ended, because it had never really started with a single date either. But the outcome mattered just as much as the louder war had. It told everyone paying attention, in Harlem and downtown both, that Bumpy Johnson couldn't be handled through comfort any more than he could be handled through force. You couldn't scare him into stepping aside, and it turned out you couldn't flatter him into it either. Whatever tools you tried using on him, patience turned out to be the one thing he had more of than anyone trying to outlast him. He spent the years after that still moving through Harlem as a figure people respected without fully understanding the extent of what he controlled, mentoring younger men who would go on to build their own empires on foundations he'd helped lay, staying visible enough that the community never stopped seeing him as one of their own, and staying careful enough that the people downtown never found another clean excuse to move against him directly. He kept getting arrested from time to time, kept getting released, kept showing up in the same diners and barbershops he'd always favored. An old man by the standards of his line of work, still sharp enough that nobody serious wanted to test him twice. He died a few years later, not in a hail of bullets, the way so many men in his profession did, but at a table in a Harlem restaurant, having just been served coffee and something to eat, his heart finally giving out after carrying him through more wars, quiet and loud, than most men ever face in a lifetime. By then, the mob had long since stopped thinking of him as a problem to be managed. He'd become something closer to what he'd always insisted on being treated as from the very beginning. Not a subject to be handled, but a partner whose terms had to be respected, whether anyone downtown liked it or not. The lesson underneath all of it, the part that outlasts Bumpy Johnson himself, is that power built on fear can be taken by force, and power built on flattery can be waited out. But power built on genuine relationships, on decades of small trust extended and returned, is a different kind of thing entirely. It doesn't sit in a bank account where someone can freeze it. It doesn't sit in a supply chain where someone can reroute it. It sits in people, in memory, in the quiet decision 100 different individuals make, over and over, to trust one man over the people trying to replace him. That kind of power is slow to build and almost impossible to steal, and it was the only kind of power Bumpy Johnson ever really needed, in 1943 when they tried to kill him, and again in 1960 when they simply tried to make him disappear by being polite about it. It's a strange kind of victory to write about, precisely because it doesn't come with the satisfying shape most stories about men like him tend to have. There's no dramatic final confrontation to point to, no single moment where the tide clearly turns, no clean villain who gets what he deserves in front of witnesses. What there is instead is a year or two of small, deliberate choices made by a man who understood that the fastest way to lose everything he'd built would have been to panic, and the surest way to keep it was to simply refuse to become smaller than the story other people were trying to write about him. That refusal, quiet as it was, turned out to be exactly as effective as gunfire had been the first time around. And in some ways it asked more of him, because there was no adrenaline to carry him through it, no clear enemy to focus his anger on, just months of watching, waiting, and trusting that the relationships he'd spent a lifetime building would still hold weight, even after everyone assumed they'd expired along with his freedom. The years that followed weren't easy ones. Harlem kept changing faster than anyone could fully track, and the heroin trade that had crept into the neighborhood while Johnson was locked away kept expanding long after he'd secured his own place back at the table. He'd go on to watch young men he'd mentored, Frank Lucas chief among them, eventually build operations far larger and far more destructive than anything Johnson himself had ever run, an irony he likely understood better than anyone, having spent years teaching those same young men the discipline and patience that would later serve far darker purposes than the ones he'd intended. But that's a different story, one that unfolds mostly after Johnson himself was gone. What matters for this one is simpler. In 1960, the most powerful criminal organization in the country decided the easiest way to deal with Bumpy Johnson was to be kind to him until he faded on his own. They learned, the same way the men at Ralph's restaurant had learned 17 years earlier, that fading was never something he knew how to do. They learned, both times, that he wasn't going anywhere.